Welcome back to Vita Activa. Last week's intervention was walking around the block to arrest rumination while saying to yourself, knowing a tool is not the same as practicing a tool. Please stop walking now. As some of you know, much of what you're seeing in these vlogs forms part of the manuscript of a book I'm trying to complete. It's called Individual Excellence, the 4 Ps of a Well-Spirited Life. Those 4 Ps are people, product, purpose, and processes. The writing is in the middle of processes. This portion of the writing and this vlog ties together themes around stress. Those themes have been discussed by McGonigal, Perry, and Winfrey, and Seligman. We proceed in the opposite order. This is important because it's impossible to create a well-spirited life if you are unable to effectively deal with stressors. Now, imagine that you are so aroused by some terrifying event that you're ready to fight or run most of the time that you're awake. An analogy is an unmoving car with its engine revving at 4,000 RPM for hours at a time. That car is representative of the human condition of fight, flight, or freeze. Helplessness is freezing. What Mayer got to and what Seligman took such pains to describe is that our default as human beings in nature is helplessness. The selective advantage of helplessness is that we often live through life-threatening situations. The selective disadvantage is that we lived, but with a lot of deeply unactualized potential, which tends to transmit itself down the generations. So Mayer's point was that we learn control by unlearning helplessness, or per Seligman's description shown here, the system now learns reacting to bad events as if they are escapable, thereby prolonging trying. This is why expert athletes, soldiers, and pilots are calm under pressure. Their brains detect and expect control when others panic or freeze. There are two main takeaways. The first is that our default response to prolonged bad events is helplessness and heightened anxiety, the revving car we were talking about. The second is that our higher cortical processes inhibit this default helplessness, end quote. The takeaways merit some discussion. In the last few weeks, we've discussed the first, the relationship between arousal, performance, stress, and anxiety. This week, we'll continue by discussing what Seligman called higher cortical processes. What he wrote is that our higher cortical processes inhibit, which means dampen or reduce, our sense of helplessness. I have to confess that the hair at the back of my neck stood up when I wrote that sentence. The reason is a wild circularity in time between Seligman's premise for positive psychology and Aristotle's differentia between animals and humans. That differentia, that which makes one thing distinctly different from another, was rationality. Rationality is what happens by choice in the cortex of the human brain, the only class of brains in the traceable history of the universe to manifest this capacity. So we have two propositions we can take from what we've been discussing. One, we reason by choice, not by default, which means we can take on sentiments, feelings, and untested ideas if we leave our minds in neutral. Two, reason happens in the cortex, the highest or the last part of the brain to have evolved, i.e. the most recent. Perry and Winfrey provided the most easily understood explanation. I will explain it using an example they provided. An older US veteran and his girlfriend were walking down a main street on a nice night after dinner. Without apparent cause, The man ran and hid behind a nearby car, laying face down, hands covering his head. His girlfriend found him sweating, highly anxious with his heart pounding. The next day, they went to see the man's psychiatrist, Dr. Perry, because the veteran felt he needed to have a professional relate the experience to his girlfriend so she wouldn't think him crazy. The vet had seen a lot of active combat 3 decades earlier. Since then, he was a drinker and a binger, depending on what was happening within. What had happened that night on the main street is that a loud motorcycle had gone by and backfired, sounding like gunfire. Psychosomatically, that is, in the mind and body, that vet was back in Korea, unarmed and afraid for his life. Here's why this story is important. Did that man think his way onto the parking lot pavement, or was that a preconscious reaction? On this diagram are the relevant levels of the brain. If you were paying close attention, the description of that terrified man included the fact that his heart was pounding. That's from the brainstem. He was sweating, also brainstem, and he was anxious, diencephalon. As life-threatening stimuli affect us from the bottom of the brain upward, this fellow didn't think his way onto the pavement. He moved, diencephalon, at rapid speed on a preconscious impulse. Quote, input from all of our senses first comes into the brain in the lower areas. None of our sensory input goes directly to the cortex. Everything first connects to lower parts of the brain. End quote. That reaction occurred because that vet had been traumatized decades earlier with arousal levels, unable to cope with such a noise. With therapy, he would and did learn to self regulate and then to realize he was no longer in military combat zones. For those not traumatized, it is known that a strong stressor temporarily shuts down the higher regions of the brain to such an extent that telling time on your watch is a challenge. That's unhealthy arousal. But equally, it's our body's way of saying, this might take you out. Get to a safe place now. In other words, with life-threatening stress, telling the time might not be that important, so the brain's emphasis moves downward from the cortex to the brainstem, which changes your hormone mix, allowing you to move. Now, in a previous issue of this vlog, I provided a definition stating that stress is what arises when something you care about is at stake. Perry's definition seems to agree with that, but takes it further. Stress is what occurs when a demand or challenge takes us out of balance, away from our regulated set points. End quote. They unpack this by stating that balance is the core of health, itemizing factors such as being in balance with friends, family, community, and nature. But they go further. They also plug inputs and outputs into the diagram of the brain levels seen here. Hormones, our autonomic nervous systems, neuroimmunology, interoceptions, and sensory inputs are all implicated as factors contributing to how we respond to our stressors. Now, I know there were some fancy words in there. You know about hormones, autonomic nervous systems regulate the things we don't think about, our breathing, our heart rate, our body temperature. Neuroimmunology is the relationship between our immune systems and our nervous systems. Interoception is our awareness of what's happening within our bodies. While those factors are obviously important, our purpose is less physiological and more explanatory. I'll leave you with one more diagram to explain this. This is what comes of an understanding of helplessness, which is very relevant to trauma. and where and why within the brain different functions occur. If you look at figure 2, you can see what therapy or repeated rehearsal, as in high-level athletics, could do. What was once unpredictable, extreme, and prolonged can be reinterpreted and entrained as predictable, moderate, and controllable, thus fostering tolerance and resilience. I hope we're getting better at posting the summary for long enough for you to read it without pausing the video. Thank you for thinking and acting. More next time. Be well.